Welcome to the G20 Interfaith Podcast, a platform where we explore the intersection of faith, global challenges, and policy. We are so happy today to have as our guest John C. Havens. John C. Havens was the founding executive director of IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, which was responsible for creating ethically aligned design, a vision for prioritizing human well-being with autonomous and intelligent systems. John helped create the IEEE 7000 Standards Series, the largest suite of international standards focused on artificial intelligence and ethical societal issues to date. John is also the Global Staff Director for IEEE Planet Positive 2030 program that produced the compendium document, Strong Sustainability by Design, Prioritizing Ecosystem and Human Flourishing with Technology-Based Solutions, and is the author of Artificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines and Hacking Happiness, Why Your Personal Data Counts and How Tracking It Can Change the World. John, it is so wonderful having you here with us. I have to admit, I've had a lot of wonderful conversations with you before this podcast, and I think our listeners are in for a very special treat.
Well, thank you to you and Stuart. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for reading my lengthy bio. I will say I'm speaking as John, and not as IEEE in terms of anything I say should be considered from John.
Thank you. John, your bio is very inspiring, and it's evident that your professional career has been just totally centered on this idea of sustainability and tech development and artificial intelligence. How did that start? What led you to focus your career on sustainability and tech development?
Well, it's a great question, and actually, I guess my full career, in the sense of what's not in this bio, is that I went to college to be a minister in the Christian tradition. And by Christian, I was raised Methodist, but basically, I mean Christian. I believe in Jesus, and I can get more in depth. But I was a history and a theater major, and I didn't know it at the time. But studying history really empowered me with a lot of the tools in what's called exegesis, EXIGESIS, which I believe just means the knowledge of how to study, how to research. And I love history. And I became fascinated with, was there actually a historical person named Jesus Christ? And how would you know? That's a matter of faith, because I really believe that God, Abba, Gaia, sort of that idea of a loving creator gave us our beautiful brains as well as our hearts. And that was part one. And then I was an actor for a long time in New York City. I was on the one Broadway show and a lot of TV and film. And I joined all the unions. I'm still in the Screen Actors Guild. That really taught me the nature of human intellectual property. And that's a big area of discussion in various AI systems conversations. And I can define that term as well. So anyway, Stuart, the long answer to your first question is, I didn't realize, and I'll say it this way, how God was equipping me to study sustainability, because formally, I only really have been in that world for about 4 or so years. And, it's such a huge, complex, and fascinating topic. 4 years is really, I'm just kind of learning the ropes. But that intersection of trying to prioritize, as the title that Mariana read, the subtitle of Strong Sustainability by Design, my belief, and for lack of a better term, agenda, and when you state it through disclosure, then people know, is to really encourage the prioritization at the beginning of any design cycle, technology, policy, market-based, of prioritizing the planet, the biosphere, and space, meaning beyond our biosphere, and a holistic sense of all humans. That can happen today. And that's why when Mariana and I have had our wonderful discussions, which are such a blessing, you'll hear me often say what I learned when I wrote my last book from 2016, Artificial Intelligence, where the subtitle is Embracing Our Humanity, Part 1, to Maximize Machines. That's my overarching logic, is anything that you're building with an AI system or technology at the outset, how do you know not that it's not just about not harming? That's sort of a yes and, right? There's no engineer, responsible technical person, policymaker who's like, we don't really care about harm, right? That's part one. But then is asking, once we know that those overt risks or harms are taken care of, what's left? What is it that we feel society or the world should encourage in that sort of vacuum that's left once we have the kind of bare bones harms taken out of the way? And usually what happens is the planet and caregiving are not factored at the beginning of design. Things are built, and then there's what's often called an ethics as an afterthought or sustainability as an afterthought logic, which becomes a completely different process and frankly, mostly crisis oriented versus at the beginning, innovation saying, how can we take care of this well?
I think it's so wonderful, John, that we're having this conversation because G20 Interfaith Forum, or IF20, we are all about bringing faith and policy together. And everything you're talking about are things that we feel so strongly about as an organization. The other thing that I think is really interesting, our focus is often on the most vulnerable communities. And a lot of the things that you're talking about especially affect the most vulnerable. They are the ones that are put into places of harm when we talk about some of these things you're talking about. So I do want you to talk a little bit more about the purposes of AI ethics, and especially Planet Positive 2030. I had an opportunity to read through that document, and it is incredible. I would recommend it to everybody to read it.
Well, first of all, thank you for reading either Ethically Aligned Design or the Planet Positive paper, Strong Sustainability by Design, because they're both about 400 pages. So, it's a thing.
A quick read.
Yeah, no, the quick read. And that's why we have the introduction, and it's split into chapters so you can dig into areas of interest. But in the introduction or the guiding principles of both documents, one of the things that became, again, I'll keep using the word blessing for me, is I learned the power of interdisciplinary thinking or planning, which simply, I'll do the very simplistic version, is I often will ask with these 5 words, who's not in the room? Because what happened with ethically aligned design is we had this beautiful 100-page compendium in 2016 that went out, and it was written exclusively by experts from North America, meaning Canada and the US, Europe and the UK. So I was thrilled, here's these 100 experts and about 6 or 7 chapters. I have to look it up to see, but we got feedback about 500 pages because IEEE is this global organization. And it was wonderful. I got to read all the feedback, and almost a majority of it, well over 50%, said, this is completely Western in orientation. Are you also going to have non-Western ethical framings? And at the time, I didn't really fully understand it, but I've learned in my community development process to say, I don't really understand that. Want to start a committee? Which is great, because then the answer is, you tell me, kind of. And we have a chapter called Classical Ethics and Artificial Intelligence Systems, which is a term that we use and the OECD often uses and recommends, because it says whatever AI tool or application you're using, when you say AI systems, it infers the data that's used by the algorithm or the systems. And secondly, it reminds people that nothing lives in isolation. There's systems and systems of systems, as engineers would say, or Danilo Meadows would say in terms of systems thinking. Anyway, the point there is what a glorious opportunity for real innovation. When I first learned and then had been sharing this committee to whoever I can, this is not an either or. This is not a dualistic choose rationality, Western ethics, or relationality. It's too broad to put people into those categories. But if one ignores one or the other, that's where I believe from my personal faith-based perspective, or also just in terms of like a market-based design orientation, if you build with only Western ethical cultural mindsets, you will cause harm. Quick example. I was running a group focused on power and technology for IEEE. It still exists. And we had a wonderful guy join the call, young guy, well, young to me because I'm 57, so he's in his 30s, named Caleb, and he was from New Zealand. And he talked about the fact that he's from a Maori tradition, which at the time I didn't know what Maori meant. And it's an indigenous tradition or group of First Nations people living largely in New Zealand, but maybe other places. He said, if you don't know, when anyone speaks on a call about data, and then they mention something that I know means it's coming from the West or Silicon Valley. This was his quote. He said, I just want to let you know that automatically that's a form of colonialism because it means you're not listening to anything about our tradition or how we live or who we are. Not purposefully, but the logic is there wasn't the question, what do you think? What is your perspective, et cetera? And he pointed out, which I thought was beautiful, in the Maori tradition, if I understand it, they're sacred places. You're not supposed to bring anything that can record. That means a audio recorder, a video recorder, or even a pencil. And I believe the logic is so you can really commune, be in community with each other, nature, and the presence of the holy. And that was a beautiful example because then it turned it into, rather than, oh my gosh, how are we going to learn everything about everybody, is if you say who's not in the room and someone says, well, it's all men. Maybe some women could join the college. There's no young people, right? And every time you add in, and then you ask the same questions that Mariana, you and the community is asking so beautifully, you simply get more perspectives so that consensus doesn't mean one answer will rule them all. It actually comes to mean consensus is a form of verbal community that leads itself to, formal ideas of peace building, et cetera.
Thank you, John. That reminds me of something that the IF20 tries to do with its network of networks. It tries to also, just like you said, it strives to include everybody involved at at the table. A couple years ago, the theme for our conference was "Leave No One Behind," and then this last year, the theme was Ubuntu, I am because we are, and just the idea of everyone being involved to discuss these issues. Turning our discussion a little bit more to focus on the specifics of ethical technology development, what are the most common human rights violations in regards to technology development and AI specifically?
How much time do we have?
Yeah.
It's a great question. And by the way, Ethically Aligned Design, I'm very proud of the about 700 people that worked on that project. The guiding principles of that document, the first three are in order that the different committee members felt should be focused on first. So human rights, which they also include planetary rights, is the first thing. So I'm so glad you asked that, Stuart, because there's a lot of tools like for the business world, the Ruggie principles, et cetera, to know how to even ask, how do you address human rights issues in anything you're doing? But that work exists. It's very hard because it goes back to a kind of a sense of who are we focusing on first and why, which then goes to ethics, the traditions that utilitarianism, doing the best for the greatest number of people, deontological ethics, which is trying to figure out what's the best thing, which can be similar but different, and then virtue ethics. And I love Ubuntu ethics, which is often where that's placed because this idea of I am because you are is not just this beautiful sense of, hey, Stuart and Mariana, I love you. You're great humans. I'm learning about you as people. Thank you for the work you're doing. It is also a sense of like, I exist because you exist. In the same way I drink a glass of water and I exist because that water's there. I exist because Stuart and Mariana exist. It's got like a physics level to it. So that's one of the reasons I love Ubuntu, or what's often called rationality-based ethical perspectives. So one of the key things about human rights and not being a lawyer, I will say that I got to say is probably one of the main things that's avoided is doing just what you said, is making an effort to include as many people as possible. That's part one. Part two is even harder. I speak for myself, where a lot of times, not to be specific in one example, but older white men, and I'm one of them, not a bad thing, but a lot of times I can, in one sense, speak anywhere in the world and I'm prioritized simply because of how I look. And I say that because then having different people come to meetings without necessarily having to say it is how to make sure everyone is heard. That's hard because then, like with me, I know I used to work in PR, and there's what we call the two chime rule, which is like in an hour-long call, you can only say two things to make sure that everyone else gets to speak. And as you may have guessed from the length of my answers, I'm not always good at the two chime. So I think one thing in terms of human rights that's often ignored at the core level is simply how do we not just invite people, but how do we teach others how to listen and really give those things. One example, I was on a call run by an indigenous group where men, it wasn't just men of a certain background, but men were invited, but they couldn't speak. Their buttons to speak, you couldn't unmute yourself. And the logic was to give the experience that a lot of people, obviously women, encounter, which is they don't get the chance for being heard while they're, around men. I didn't mean to make this gender oriented, but mainly to say that from a human rights perspective, when people's, in indigenous words, free, prior, and informed consent, or these other things of like really demonstrating that someone is involved, where they say they feel involved, that's probably the biggest thing I've found in quote AI efforts, because almost always it's dominated by a few voices.
Now, I agree with you as a woman with some of your gender points, 100%. It is very hard being, especially an intelligent woman, because you get into these meetings and oftentimes you are not acknowledged. So I completely understand. But we are in reality. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it would be nice if we could start from scratch, but the reality is AI's here, and AI is being used by everybody for all of its warts and all. But my question goes to, so what can we do now? I mean, as you talked about, we're really dealing with a major problem, a major issue. And so it's here. What can we do to fix it? Because I see most of the restrictions are happening through lawsuits after the harm's been done. So is there anything we can do to curtail this, to make it better now?
Yeah, by the way, I love the word curtail. So I just have to say, as a writer, when someone says a word, I'm also a musician. Beautiful words to me are like beautiful music, and you have an amazing vocabulary, Mariana. Just saying. Um, I think here is where faith-based groups have maybe the biggest opportunity. Is that there's this allowance for speaking in paradigms where it's recognized that a subjective truth, as proclaimed, for lack of a better term, by a faith or a religion, it's this sort of permission on one level for scientific empiricism to live alongside of insert other thing here. Now, the thing in my study of like the scientific method, if you dig into it, the scientific method is in fact a scientific method, right? There wasn't this, all omnipotent being that brought down this concept of empirically testing things that then turned into objective physics-based reality. This is why I love the scientists or physicists or thinkers that I admire the most recognize the scientific theory as a beautiful process of what is basically defined as iterative learning, where we know that something will come along later that may challenge that initial finding. And also, you can't really put the scientific testing in a box per se, when it's how do we take one element and analyze it with nothing else biasing around it. So I say all that because studying the nature of objectivity versus subjectivity and putting all those words over here is where, in my experience, faith-based doctrines of so many groups are not focused on empirical realities in one sense, hence the term faith, right? So coming from a Christian background where I wanted to be a minister, I studied a lot of Paul's epistles and New Testament scripture. And Paul is supposedly quoted as saying, I forget which book of the New Testament, but if Christ has not risen from the dead, our preaching is in vain. And that's tough. When you talk about the resurrection to people, and there's many resurrection themes, ideas, stories, premises in multiple religions. where one might also define something like the metamorphosis of a butterfly as a form of resurrection. But there's a different level where people accept something, where someone at some point said, hold on. What John just said is faith. Great. We're going to move that over here. And now empiricism, Western-based, quote, scientific empiricism rules all. Now, that's faith. One believes that that's the case. And here I'm not discounting the beauty of, quote, science. I'm saying that the definition of objectivity versus subjectivity can sometimes deny the reality of subjectivity, where if Stuart and Mariana and John are the only humans that exist with our core identity that I believe are provided by a loving creator seeking relationship with all of us while we are asked to care for others and the planet, if I'm the only John C. Havens in the world, and I can prove that with my PII data and my location and all these things and US government, yada, yada, and I'm the only John, then my subjective truth equals my subjective truth. It's not more important than Stuart or Mariana. But from a what can we do now logic, there's a lot of technical work I've been working on for more than 15 years, where some standards for my IEEE, and also kind of a recognition that if Gen AI, especially, so faulty, so erroneous in so many ways that I can happily go into, ask one AI tool being used for everything, erroneously causing harm, then there's this beautiful, sacred opportunity to say, no one should be here telling Stuart or Mariana, hey, this is what you do, but I will protect with the greatest vigilance I've been given everyone's right to state their own subjective truth. And then remind anyone who wants to integrate with you all, digital, virtual, and whatever technology, if you don't give people ways to, in genuine disclosure, provide their thoughts back, that is the greatest potential evil I see in the world today, because it's not saying, it's not just denying all the things that the human rights violations are focused on. It is saying, I am denying your opportunity for free will, for agency, and the opportunity to explore how you could unite with your creator or your sense of your sacred self.
Thank you, John. I've never heard that explanation of the importance of including religion in ethical technology development, but also, as an interfaith cooperation organization, we focus on including religion in other spheres. I've just never heard it explained that way. So thank you. One example that might be an example, maybe you can let me know if this is a good example or not, but you wrote something that says the planet is an actor, not a resource, or it should be seen as an actor, not a resource. Is that an example, something that maybe faith-based organizations or religions can help provide that truth?
Oh, definitively. And thank you for asking that. Pope Francis, in his 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si, reframed what are normally called in the New Testament the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, talking about humans. Most people think that if Jesus existed, he was speaking to humans at that time. I think it was the Sermon on the Mount. But Francis, whose writing I thought was so beautiful and powerful regarding issues of artificial intelligence technologies, said back in 2015, before Gen AI, hold on a second, everybody. If God, I'll use Catholic or Christian oriented terms, Catholic, capital small c, created the world, then we are supposed to be stewards of the living planet that God gave us to be a part of. Now, this is where I don't want to get into, and you mentioned religious. I'm using the term faith, Stuart, so that it encapsulates, there's formal, and I'm not saying there's one that's better or worse. I just mean formal church, the Catholic Church, sovereign, whatever, versus a faith, which might be whatever. But basically, what Francis taught to me, at least when I read that from his perspective, at least, was I've been raised in certain circles in different Christian churches with this idea that humans have sovereignty or dominance over the planet. And I think there was no ill intention. It wasn't like people were like, let's use the planet up as fast as we can because God said we could. But I think there was this idea that, like, the Garden of Eden, we were given animals to name and they are, under our dominion. Where Francis, at least how he wrote it, and I'm going to get a lot of things wrong, please read the original, has this beautiful reminder that if God made water and plants and animals, there is a sovereignty and a beauty, and if not a equality in every level, a responsibility for us, almost like parents with children, to take care of the planet, not as a resource, like you said, Stuart, like, I need a cup of water. Well, drain on the aquifer. Here we go, and we're good, from a consumerist mindset, but prioritizing if these things were given to us by grace and in love, then we are stewards, caregivers, not just users. And that's a fundamental reason that I will say, and there's many indigenous traditions that also, from my understanding, a friend of mine in India points out that water is worshipped as an entity, as a personage. And that's easy, I think, maybe for some Westerners to be like, worshiping water as a god, that seems crazy. And then I say, well, I don't know about you, but I was raised in a Methodist tradition with baptism. Then I went to a Baptist church with baptism. So water is a big deal and an analogy to the Holy Spirit in many traditions. So rather than judge how people formally say worship water or nature, is this recognition that if nature exists and it's a gift, taking care of it is not just a lovely responsibility a la Ubuntu. It is a physics-based reality. I can say whatever I want in this call about the amount of water used from each time I prompt something in Sora or Perplexity or Claude and have pretty accurate measures, and 14 people will disagree with me. No. But then I say, hey, how much water is in your local aquifer? And usually there's silence, because I know, working in this space for years, that's one of the main things from the water hydrology-based global community is, before judging anything else, remember I said artificial intelligence, embracing our humanity to maximize machines. We have to embrace our planetary reality with questions like water and simply know how much water is nearby before any type of AI tool, cryptocurrency, whatever it is, functionality happens, where we're taking water and we don't know how much is there. So that's a reason I will stress, and frankly, we have to prioritize caring for the planet, because if the world builds thinking, well, we'll build these things to help the planet as an afterthought, we are depleting the sacred resources that can't be replaced in the way that we think they can, in light of not taking the time to prioritize them at the outset of design.
John, I have two questions, and I don't know, you're so eloquent. You might be able to bring these two together.
Okay.
But my first question is, I would love for you to tell our listeners why, I mean, we say AI and we really mean a lot of different things, but we all lump it into this one, artificial intelligence. And I know this is something you feel very strongly about. Let's talk about AI in terms of being very specific about what we're talking about. So that's number one. And number two, and you might be able to bring this together. You also talk about hacking happiness. And I really enjoyed this idea of artificial intelligence and how it's affecting happiness, because I do think that it is affecting happiness more than we realize or think about. So I know that those are two seem desperate questions, but I know that you can bring those two together.
Well, thank you. I will try. And you know what I love is, a couple of years ago, someone said, John, you keep conflating things. And at the time, I thought it was kind of pejorative. Not you, by any means. But then I've now grown to kind of love, not when someone's trying to say, hey, John, whatever, but is to recognize that patterns don't fall into necessarily simple buckets. So anyway, FYI, in terms of, I love that you asked that, and I will do my best to bring them together. So part one is just a reality. Like, this is not just John's opinion, but I really appreciate your asking the question. To me, working in this space for only 12 years, and unlike, Mariana, your husband, who's been in the space for 50, I am not worthy, but the term, I was just watching a new AI documentary called Ghost in the Machine, which I cannot recommend strongly enough, talking about the history of artificial intelligence. And you can see the person who named that term, and he says it was a marketing term. By the way, there's nothing wrong with having a marketing term. But the point is this idea that this like mystical thing just happened. It was like, no. There was a guy named Wiener who had this idea of what's called cybernetics. And it was gaining a lot of popularity around the time that Dartmouth had a conference in 1956. And the term artificial intelligence came into being. That is framed around the concept that human cognition is the only part of intelligence. Now, I'm being passionate when I say that, because that said, that's a reality that people believed. They're allowed to believe that cognition is all there is to, quote, intelligence. And that once a certain level of intelligence can be achieved, humans, in one sense, are not needed any longer. This is oftentimes what's not really spoken out loud, right? Hey, we're building this AGI, or these terms that sound mystical, and or ASI, artificial superintelligence, will be this being thing. And that's not a faith-based perspective, right? It's absolutely speculative, hoped for, right? But then it's defined in the moment that humans are replaced. That does not sound like a benevolent, loving form of any type of creation, et cetera, that I'm interested in, honoring personally. But back to your question, there are different types of AI applications. For instance, one is called deep learning, which is oftentimes used for analysis for things like photographs. And to give a case study, this is where I ask people, what application are you using? If I say, for instance, like I went to Davos and I spoke recently, the World Economic Forum thing, and I was on a panel and a guy talked about his artificial intelligence tool that he had used to save 150 women and children from sex trafficking. And as a parent, that is perhaps one of the most important things anyone could do. And after he finished, I thanked him and I said, can you be explicit? What type of AI tool were you using? Because I knew it had to be deep learning. He said, deep learning. And I said, can you elaborate? To analyze photos, you want that tool? He said, yes, Gen AI is not the tool you want to analyze photos. I can give you more on that in a minute. But then I said, how much computing power is needed for the deep learning that you do? This is where not defining different types of AI is a harm. I'm so glad you asked this, Mariana. To be clear, for the interfaith work we're doing, for anyone in the world who says AI, and they don't say the application, they will cause harm, period. I believe, and I will say it's irresponsible even to say we're using AI when, in this case, let me give an example. This guy knew that deep learning would get the job done better to analyze photos. It's very good for pattern recognition without the errors of another application called Gen AI. Then I said, how much computing power do you use? He said, we can run what we do on 2 laptops. I am on a laptop right now. That means how much water and energy is used? X amount. Gen AI, large language models, use massive amounts of computing, and the hyperscale data center proliferation that's happened for about 3.5, 4 years demands, in one sense, from society that AI is so important. These 3 times the size of football stadium buildings that use oftentimes potable water, where nearby it's not known how much water is in the aquifer watersheds, at the ultimate expense, oftentimes, of local community members paying the electricity bills for that beast of a building that goes up without democratic voting on that going up. So I get this passionate because if, as responsible technology or policy leaders, everyone doesn't say, we're talking about blank, the benefits of Gen AI, great, then talk about the benefits, but make sure to say, recognizing that we know the energy and water usage of these tools justifies what we're doing. And then I'll be the one to raise my hand and say, can you define justification in terms of what we're prioritizing? Because if the world prioritizes speed, efficiency, and productivity in isolation, then resources, when we call water and energy and the planet resources, use them up as fast as you need. Tell the world about it, that's not relevant. When you start from the faith-based perspective and you take a deep breath, which I'll do now, and especially you ask many indigenous or global traditions that say water and the planet are sacred, and you start there, the question is not how will AI help the planet? The question is, how do we help the planet first, foremost, to flourish, and all people and species that exist within it? And then we can say, what's the right tool of any kind, AI application or other, to make sure that that happens? Otherwise, there's no justification. for what we build. It is irresponsible. So other quick example, I was reading a paper the other day on cognitive sovereignty, which if you love that geeky behavioral science, it simply means the study kind of agency. And they were talking about artificial intelligence. Wonderful paper. I learned a lot. Then they quoted a report from 2021 where they said artificial intelligence had done this amazing work by curing different types of breast cancer. What I knew instantly, 2021, it was before November 2022 when OpenAI released ChatGPT. So I knew, and I was right when I checked the footnotes that I assumed were correct, but probably weren't if it was Gen AI oriented, that they meant a deep learning technique. So for lack of a better term, it's really hard to stress this enough. And I know it took a long time in this, Mariana, but it's kind of like one of the main harms that's happening across the board in anything is to say AI when someone means a specific tool.
I did want to say your wonderful comment about taking care of the world and how important that is. I this morning I usually walk in the mornings up in the mountains. I live in Alpine, and it was such a beautiful morning. As I was walking, the birds were out. It was just I watched the sunrise. It was a pink sky, and as I was doing it, I said, "This brings me happiness." And I think that sometimes this and yet I come inside and I spend most of my day on my computer. And that doesn't bring me happiness. But being outside brings me happiness. And so how do we bring those two together? You know, we talk about AI. How do we bring AI and happiness, real happiness, I'm talking about here?
Happiness, when I first studied it, came about because my father, who was a psychiatrist, passed away, and I learned about the empirical science of positive psychology. And I bring this up because, as a rule, whether it's Freud or Jung, this logic of negative affect with an A, emotion, affect. Humans have pain. And if you can find a therapist or a loving pastor or person of faith that can help you deal with those issues, you can kind of remove or talk about that affect. And if you picture yourself, maybe your body or spirit is like a vase, and the water that's the negative water, you pour out. What positive psychology as an empirical science has said for well over 30 years is, well, if you can take the negative affect out, can you put the positive affect in? And so you asked about happiness. When I first started formally studying the science of happiness writ large, whether economic, statistical, behavioral science, I learned about the beautiful Greek word eudaimonia, which is an Aristotelian term about this kind of all-encompassing flourishing, where a momentary, say, mood or happiness, which is beautiful, natural, a gift, is part of what makes up a larger sense of societal well-being or flourishing. But there's also all these factors that contribute to someone's actual happiness or well-being or flourishing, however that's defined. Here, I'd recommend the wonderful documentary, I forget what year it's from, called Happy, the movie. And anytime I can, as a former actor, I recommend films or stories because they oftentimes will help people learn much faster. But this movie opens up with a narrator going around the world and asking different people, what is happiness to you? Or are you happy? And it opens up, or near the beginning of the documentary, on a guy who's driving a rickshaw. And I always forget where he is. I think it's like the Philippines. So you see him driving, holding a rickshaw, running through streets, and there's like businessmen on their phones. And they ask him, are you happy? He says, yes, I'm happy. Sometimes people hit me with a stick when I'm driving. I prefer they don't do that. But as a rule, yes, I'm very happy. And they show him with his family. And there's like 15 people around him, all smiling. His quote house is this sort of dilapidated tent flapping in a typhoon-like wind. So I watch it and I'm like, I would prefer that guy not have a typhoon dilapidated wind structure, but he's beaming with happiness because he has community. I am because we are. Then they cut to, this is why this film is so wonderful to watch. And they interview all these experts, Ed Diener, Barbara Fredrickson, the real leaders in positive psychology, scientifically, as it were. But then they cut to this story, and it's very sad, with a woman, a wife, and her, I think it's daughter, who's a widow from Japan. And her husband had committed suicide because of the stress he felt because of productivity, efficiency. This is what a lot of Gen AI based leaders, and when you go to the top, who's funding it, Preach. This is happiness, productivity, and efficiency. I don't think, Mariana, from the way you described your walk, that you were like, I was out in nature for 10 minutes today. And yesterday I was out in nature for 20 minutes. And I maximized nature efficiency by being in nature less time today. And I was more. That's not what I heard. Because that's not the message. The message is, I believe, since we're near the end of our conversation in a positive way, I believe, like I said, my faith-based belief, not IEEE by any means, is that we're here on earth to do our best, to love ourselves enough. And in my case, hopefully not too much TMI, went through a divorce, wrote 2 books on happiness. That was kind of embarrassing. Did I do something wrong? But recognizing that I believe the reason that we are here is to be accepting and kind to ourselves with these tools. Positive psychology is very oriented towards what do you do? You are grateful as a practice because it empirically, mentally fires your dopamine and et cetera to remember, hey, you have people in, like my kids, my wife right now, Gabrielle, I'm grateful. Thank you, Lord, for these people that I have. And as you even say those things, oftentimes what's done in prayer and meditation in multiple global faith-based traditions, you are reminded these are the gifts that you've been given right now. You, Stuart, you, Mariana, these are the gifts that I, if there's a loving Abba-based Father, Yahweh, I love you, and I gave you these things, these people. And you are here to be stewards of these beautiful people. And by stewards, I mean loving caregivers. And it's the same with the planet. So I, on a personal level, I suck at what is mostly done as sustainability, like recycling plastic and whatever else. For whatever reason, I've been given these opportunities to speak to you guys, for instance, and ask what at the higher levels is it that society says we are valuing and seeing and that we're not valuing. And I learned from heroes like Riane Eisler, Eleanor Ostrom, oftentimes female economists, showing the world, you know what wasn't factored in to GDP after the Second World War? Caregiving, which is really about taking care of kids, which oftentimes is done by women globally, and the planet. And why are we where we are today in terms of the Anthropocene, meaning what most people call the era since the industrialization, where we are now? All these answers, well, this happened, this happened, this happened. My answer in summation is, I believe the answer of what we're all struggling with is how to deal with this mentality and fear at a pretty core level that A, we aren't enough. I'll say for myself. In prayer, I often struggle and say, Lord, I don't feel I'm worthy to be here. But then the message I believe in is, John, I love you. This is God speaking. But in one sense, it's not about you. I'm here to love you so that you can have the capacity to live your life trying to love others. And then the answer, well, can a machine love a person? All these companions, that all these things, like, I'm going to put that over here as we come to a close and say, I don't believe my charge or that the loving creator's charge is step out of the way and let whatever technology based on society's pressures to get these things into our present fast gives me permission to back away from trying to love other people and taking care of the planet, which what I've been given is talking to people like you, working on standards, and from an economic standpoint, saying, for instance, like I just read about this today, even though it happened in January, Elon Musk has filed with the FCC to have, I forget how many billions of dollars of satellites go into space. And you might be saying, why are we talking, John, why did you mention that at the end of our AI thing? But if you've worked in the personal data arenas, I have for years, and then you ask about what actually dominates how these tools are controlled, it's data. And the EU AI Act, wherever that data is stored, right? You know this, that whether it's an island or whatever, the ownership of the data in that physical geographical location can sometimes have ramifications on the legal aspects of the tools. And now Elon Musk, and I'm speaking very much for myself, not my employer, has said and gotten permission to put, I think it's thousands of satellites into space, where that means that the data of you, Mariana, Stewart, and me can go into these satellites. And there's no sovereignty. There's no legal sovereignty. There's no economic sovereignty. So my final point will be, I've looked this up for our talk today, which is, this is from Colossians 3, the New International Version of Scripture, where it talks about, it says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And the idea is to put to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And by that, in this example, I'll say the earthly nature is to think, I have to have enough stuff. I have to be fast. And if I use X tool, especially Gen AI, I have to keep up with the Joneses, and this will make everything right. Versus, I believe, the much harder journey of saying, well, what happens if every person as they exist now has worth simply because they're born? And then we are charged to love them as well as we can. And what if this beautiful planet, as much as we all may try to be sustainable, and I love that you went out in nature, I do the same. It is a reckoning. It's a time of saying, what are we going to put first? Other people on the planet, or the tools that a lot of people are saying, do this and they'll make this better. Step one is hard, and it's recognizing the worth and the love and the joy that comes from recognizing our worth, and especially our beautiful planet.
John, thank you so much. This has been such a fabulous discussion, and I've learned so much. I'm sure you have too, Stuart.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And as we finish this episode, we would invite all of our listeners to continue to listen to us and look forward to, we're hoping to have an actual series of webinars on AI, and you'll probably see John again during those discussions, but we would invite you to be a part of those webinars as well, where we can go into even greater depth into some of these issues that we introduced today.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the G20 Interfaith Forum podcast.
The podcast provides information and discussions on the G20 Interfaith Forum, but the views expressed are those of the individuals involved and not necessarily the official stance of the forum.
The content is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice or expert recommendations. Listeners should exercise personal responsibility, seek professional guidance, and conduct further research when making decisions based on the podcast.
The information shared may not always reflect the most current developments, and external links or resources are provided for additional information but are not endorsed or controlled by the podcast.
By listening to the podcast, listeners acknowledge and accept these disclaimers. Please be aware that the content of this podcast may be subject to copyright. Unauthorized copy, distribution, and reproduction of any part of the podcast is prohibited.